There was never high hopes for busing in Boston when the desegregation order came down. Not in this city, because in this city, we already knew, blacks knew that if you go to South Boston to Carson Beach, you might not come back. That was just real, and nobody wanted to send their children to those neighborhoods. I can remember parents saying, how can I send my child to a neighborhood that I won't go to?
Before I introduce our panel, I'd just like to ask how many of you are or were residents of Boston in the greater Boston, in the mid-1970s and 80s when the events, look at that, quite a few, that's wonderful. When the events we will be reflecting upon tonight took place. I just want to say we'll be especially interested in what you have to say when we get to the audience discussion, so please don't be shy. The National Humanities Conference is being held in Boston this week, and we are pleased to welcome here tonight colleagues from state humanities councils all across the country, and also from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Welcome to Boston. Tonight we are here to explore the history and present-day consequences of our nation's failed effort to achieve racially integrated public schools. As provocation for our discussion, Pulitzer-prize winning journalist and historian Douglas Blackmon will screen excerpts from a documentary film he is producing about public school integration in his hometown of Leland, Mississippi. Doug will be joined on stage by another Pulitzer-prize winning journalist, familiar to most of you, Farah Stockman, whose series of columns in the Boston Globe on the legacy of the Boston busing crisis won the coveted prize in 2016. Farah now writes for the New York Times. Filling out our panel are two people who experienced the tumultuous events in Boston firsthand. One of them, Patrick MacDonald, wrote about this time in his best-selling memoir, All Souls, a family story from Southie. And the other, the Reverend Cheryl Harris, was a recent graduate of Girls High School here in Roxbury when court-ordered busing took effect. Both Michael and Cheryl have vivid memories of that period, which they will share with us tonight.
I am Doug Blackmon. Thanks for the kind introduction. And thank all of you for coming out. The clip you're going to see in a minute after this first one is actually something that no one other than me and one other person has ever seen. And so it really is a sneak peek of something that comes from what is still very much a work in progress. So every writer or artist always has to say to an audience when they're not finished with something that ask for your forgiveness in advance for any wrinkles you may see, and you will see a few things where it's not yet a finished and polished part of the film. But what the second clip is all about, the whole story is centered on this little town in Mississippi and the story of desegregation of the schools there, but then also what happens over the next 50 years. What are the consequences of both the successes and the failures that happen there? And the whole film is told, for the most part, through the eyes of or centered on a group of children, of which I'm one, who were born in or around the summer of 1964 during Freedom Summer, and who then coincidentally were also in the first class of children in Mississippi to begin the first day of first grade, black and white together, and go all 12 grades. And so this film is built around that group of children, and who now are, many of them, the leaders in that same community, the president of the school board, the police chief, the mayor, all extraordinarily happen to come from that small group of children. But so in the second clip, though, what you'll see are a series of dialogues with mostly with people who were adults at the time of desegregation in 1969 and 70, some of whom were teachers in the all-black segregated school, some who were teachers in the white system, and then almost all of these are people who then taught in the integrated system afterwards as well. But what they talk through is the lead up to the events that occurred in 1970 and then the way that the schools were came to be fully integrated at that point in time. I won't say any more real detail about it, except that this film is also something of a study on the ways that people can very honestly remember things very differently, which is a fundamental human condition, and people can be telling their version of the truth over and over again about the same events in ways that are very different. And it's not quite as stark in this sequence as it is in some other parts of the film, but you may pick up on some of that. And the last thing I'll say, and I'm sure we'll talk about this some afterwards as well, is just that the purpose of this project really is to raise the question of, should we be satisfied as a nation with how things have turned out? And what I call the central paradox in American life, and that is that over the last 50 years, we've done such an extraordinary job in America in confronting and doing away with, for the most part, individual racism, the kind of person-to-person racism and discrimination that was so paralyzing to America in the past. We've so successfully combated that, and yet we have failed, obviously, at a more collective objective. And so we remain a country that's constantly on the edge of, or feels like it is constantly on the edge of disaster when it comes to race. And so it's just this paradox of how can we have succeeded in so many ways and seemingly have failed as well. And this film looks at where public schools and the opportunity they presented fit into that, and what the consequences are of how things turned out.
Well, you can't hurry God. Just have to wait. You have to trust him and give him time. Well, no matter how long it takes. Well, I know he's the God you can't hurry. He'll be there. Just don't worry. Well, he may not come when you want him, but he's right on time. Mm-hmm.
Long it takes. That's your voice, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it. I can't think of all them songs.
Yeah. Can you
He
sing
said he may not come when you want him, but he right on time. You can't hurry God. You just have to wait. You have to trust him and give him time. Oh, no matter how long it takes.
I said, I can't stay in this cotton field all of my life. I got to find something else to do. So I made up my mind. I said, I want to go to school. I want to go to college.
You can't hurry God.
Our school population needs to reflect what our town population is. I thought all white people didn't like black people because my own father wouldn't acknowledge me.
I think the absence of like anything good, it just helped my drive to be better. The abundance of negativity is like it supported my positivity.
He'll be there. Don't you worry.
I think the whole community should be involved. And my thing is, color shouldn't have anything to do with it. We have to come together and work together.
Yes, I grew up in Leland and with my family. My dad, he was principal at this school. My mother was a teacher here. That's what she always did. She taught. Well, for a long time, she became the guidance counselor in later years.
And along with that, she taught music lessons.
Yeah. We lived on the school campus for a few years. Our house was across the street. So I actually played on the schoolyard all the time, rode my bicycle. I remember riding my bicycle all around this outside here. But we lived here until I finished high school. We lived over on this track in a completely segregated neighborhood, completely segregated. When we knew about all of the things that were going on, so far as blacks and white. But our regular routine was just like an average family.
There was still anger in the minds of black Americans because of what had happened in the past atrocities.
I was born in 45, yes. I came of age in the 60s, a child of the 60s. I thought it was a very happy world. When I was a younger child, I was not aware, I guess, of anything about civil rights.
There's anger. There's anger about what happened. The lynchings, the cross burnings. There's anger.
Mississippi's always been in my heart. I loved this place. I love the beauty of the Delta, the history. This place gave me an awful lot to carry with me.
There have been times, like going to the cotton fields where the person that owned the plantation was not always kind, didn't always speak favorably, and so those were the times that I remembered that there were some people that didn't like me because of my color. But it was always a challenge to me. One day we can look each other in the eye. You know better, I'm no better, we're equal.
We chose to live in Leland. We arrived in September of 1967. The schools were already partially integrated under a freedom of choice plan. In the beginning, there were no white children in the previously all-black school, but there were black children in the previously all-white school.
You could just freely go over and enroll in that school, even though you knew that you would have some animosity toward you if you enrolled there. That's what it was. You just could go where you wanted, freedom of choice.
But it was only a handful of families here in Leland that was willing to put their kids into the school system over there at first.
Oh, they went over to the white school. Oh, they did, okay. No, none came over this way, but a few of the black parents sent their children to the white school. But I can't remember any whites coming over to this school until the desegregation order came down, of course.
You know, it was a lot of pressure on the parents who had their kids there. I think some of them just didn't want they thought it was destroying the black schools, I think.
A lot of the people in the community, not a lot of them, but a few who did go over to that school, they thought that maybe they would get better, the teachers were better trained.
I thought by having these integrated schools that our kids would have an opportunity to have a better education. This is what I thought. All blacks that was involved was nervous about it because we didn't know what was going to happen next, but we were still trying to do what we felt like was right.
They saw the need to assign a few of the black teachers to the white school and a few of the white teachers to the black school.
This is the transitioning period.
I happen to be one of the ones who did go to the white school.
There were news stories all of the time about the push for integration in different parts of the country, of the South, and in different ways, like the sit-ins in different places. As the school year 1969-70 began to approach, there was a lot more discussion about that full integration is getting closer. You have one shot at raising your children. You don't get do-overs.
And I can't remember any incidents that happened when they went to the white school.
It was something that nobody had done before. We didn't know how it was going to go, but we felt strongly that we had to give it a chance. There were several community meetings, as I recall. There were little placards with statements that said, keep a positive attitude about this. Don't assume that it's going to all be negative. And then as we got closer to knowing that total integration was actually going to happen soon, this group that pledged to keep our children in public school decided to buy an ad in the local newspaper, the Leland Progress, and put our name on the line that we are committed to public education and we plan to keep our children in public school.
I remember the superintendent coming over and explaining to us what was going on, and it was going on because of this order. And of course he was expecting everybody to try to make the path smooth, you know, try to smooth the path when we desegregated. And we did so as much as possible. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's here. It's going to happen. Let's make the best of it. Most of us made up our minds, and I guess the white teachers did the same thing. It's here. We're going to either take it or we can leave and go to private schools or whatever. So we knew we weren't going to private school to teach, so we weren't going any place else.
Oh, I remember that the faculties actually got along pretty well, the people on the faculty, after complete desegregation. The whites and the blacks, some of us became friends on down through the years.
School was closed for, as I remember it, for a week.
Because they had to get all the little desks at one school and then all of the larger desks at another school. So it was a working thing for us because we helped that. You know, the books had to be exchanged. So it's just more or less getting the rooms straightened out.
So we're assigning teaching duties to the teachers. Now we got this integration thing going here. So white parents were reluctant, a lot of them, about blacks teaching their children. And so they wanted to be sure that the black teachers were qualified, maybe were able to speak or teach or whatever it was. So they were a little reluctant. Oh, at the time of integration, my expectations of what white families would do would be to leave the schools. I didn't expect them to stay. I didn't expect all of them to stay. And see, a lot of that, I think, had to do with ignorance. I'm sorry. I mean it, not knowing. If you don't know something, you're fearful of it. And so many of the white families had only known their maids, and some of them just, they were people, but not people, you know?
I really had never had a conversation with a black person as equals until my children started school in Leland, and Veronica Richardson was one of my oldest son Glenn's teachers. And I wanted her to know that I was okay with my child being in her class.
So it surprised me when things went pretty smoothly here. You know, we didn't have any kind of rock throwing, bomb throwing things. When they first did desegregation, of course, they had to come to school over here because that was the only available thing, except for a Catholic school. But after a few years, you had available private schools.
I know a lot of people left at that time to go to Pillow.
And some people in the community didn't want the mixture, so those schools were born at that time. But at that time, it didn't really bother me that they had that private schools were set up. But I always wondered after a while, how could all of them go to, how could all the whites go to the private school? And what was there that was so different? That's what I've been wanting to ask somebody. It's just exactly what, and I wonder if we could really get to that. What made that change? Because we catered to everybody. We catered to the whites a good bit.
After full integration, if you just took percentages over the entire school population, in the public schools in Leland, it was approximately 80% black and 20% white. I had really close friends who made the decision to send their children to private schools. And I could understand their choice, even though I didn't agree with their choice. And I would say that the majority of them never gave me a hard time. This was not something that kept us from being friends and kept us from going to church together.
I think if we had talked more among ourselves, and we could have worked out, the adults, we could have worked out a few more things where more of the whites could remain in the public schools.
I would have been outside this building for the last time in May of 1970. I was finishing up my junior year of high school and getting ready to leave Leland.
I was substitute teaching in the spring of 1970, and there was a pretty massive student walkout from Leland High School, led by student leaders, as far as I know.
When the day happened of the boycott here, part of me was drawn in because this felt right, to be doing something. I mean, I had grown up knowing that things weren't right. It's not like it just became obvious. The segregation was so totally pervasive. There were people who honestly believed in their heart that black people had no souls, that they were more like animals. There was this huge crowd out here, and I just walked up and said, "What's going on?" And so I was like, "Well, I want to join you." And the next thing I know, everybody's gone down to the auditorium. The teachers came out on the stage and talked for a little while. You know, now you're here, you want to make a statement. This is what you need to do. You need to organize your grievances. I remember the word being used. You need a list of grievances to bring to the principal.
There were a few white students who also walked out and marched with them. And they marched from Leland High School, the Dean campus, through town to the black high school, the Lincoln High School. Now I was on the Lincoln campus that day, and it was a scary thing. Nobody knew what might happen.
No, I didn't have any knowledge of what it was really about. All I knew to do was to go to school and have fun and try to get along. And I can remember my mother giving my sisters and brothers some strong advice and harsh words that she said she didn't care who walked out. You all better stay at school.
Everybody was very calm. You know, there was no yelling or people were sitting quietly in their seats, having a discussion. I think people should be proud of us, the way it went off.
The walkout from the high school really unnerved the community because it was almost like it gave people a reason to say, "See, that's why I don't want to send my kids to public school." Today it was a peaceful march, but who knows what the next one might be like. For the white community, it seemed almost like a slap in the face, where, okay, you have won on the integration, and now you're not happy, you walk out.
After the boycott here that day when I got home, my mother met me at the front door and said, "What's going on?" Because she had been receiving phone calls saying things like, "Your daughter's going to die," and hanging up. I do think that after that, the night riding and the phone calls accelerated. You could hear somebody run across the lawn yelling, and I think the word might be nigger or nigger lover, multiple incidences of that kind of thing. And then, of course, the words nigger in probably about 8-foot letters across our lawn, with weed killers so that the grass would turn brown.
if you were called a nigger lover back then, that was the worst thing that could happen to you. Your whole livelihood, your social standing, everything. If you were easy on the blacks, that was bad.
I don't recall being afraid, but I guess my parents, I guess maybe they didn't know what to do about all of the threats. And of course, when the insurance was canceled and the bank called the loan, then it became very serious.
I lost hundreds of subscribers. It cost me all kind of subscribers, and of course that's what you base your advertising on. You get your advertising from subscribers. But it was both ostracism and economic.
One of my teachers here at this school cornered me one day, and after the boycott, when I was identified as having participated, cornered me in the hallway and asked me if I would ever marry a black man. Would you marry one? And I said, if I loved him. and he said, black fat lips and all? You would do that? And I was honestly didn't know how to respond. My father called his boss and said, I need you to transfer me out of here now. And so they did, and I guess they offered him Lubbock, Texas, and he took it.
So thank everybody for being here. Thank you all for being here tonight. How many of you have been part of these reading circles? That's just incredible. Every time I get stressed out about the future of this country, something happens that renews my faith in it. So tonight it's the reading circles. So Doug, thank you for sharing your secret clip with us. So that woman was your mom?
Yes, the white lady you saw the most of, that's my mom. Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, the white lady you saw the most of, that's my mother, Sarah Blackmon.
So you were how old at this time?
I was, at the event she's describing in that clip, I'm 5 years old.
You're 5 years old. You're not going to make a cameo appearance?
Not in that section.
Okay.
Though the police chief character that you saw, the African-American guy in a suit who was talking about his mother telling his older siblings to not to participate in the walkout, he was a classmate of mine. So
Okay.
we both would have been 5 at the time, and then and it's amazing that it speaks to what a dramatic event it was that he might have been 6 by then, but that he actually remembers the circumstances around that event.
So we definitely want to get to your questions, and we want to bring in Boston, because that was Mississippi, a rural area. Boston's an urban area, but there's a lot of parallels and a lot of differences. I guess I want one more personal question to you, and then I want to bring in Michael and Cheryl. But did you ever have a tough time going? You were essentially a minority. You were 20% of white kids were 20% of your school. Did you ever think, man, this really stinks?
Absolutely. Though through all of my childhood, I did not know what had happened. I didn't know any of this. In fact, I wasn't aware that I was in that first integrated class until I was in college, and I was reading a book about actually an athlete from Mississippi, but who also graduated from high school in 1982, and in the Marcus Dupree, once the greatest, the most talented high school football player in American history, from Philadelphia, Mississippi. And I was reading a book about him, and in the prologue to it, it made reference to that he was part of this class in Mississippi, and that was the first that I knew of it. And I was in my 20s then, and I called my mother up and said, is this right? Was I in the very first class of black and white kids together? And she said, yes, it was. And so almost all of this stuff I was unaware of as a child, but I was very aware, as I've said in other circumstances, that it seemed to me throughout most of my childhood that generally speaking, everybody was mad at everybody else pretty much all the time. But it was mysterious to me because I knew that, even though I didn't understand what had happened exactly, I knew that I was a white kid at public school, and that somehow there was something virtuous about that. That there was this message that we were the good whites because we were in public school. But most of my white friends from church and Boy Scouts and Little League went to private schools, and I knew that, and I knew that they were tainted by that in some fashion. But I didn't really understand. But then I also knew that they had animosity toward the white kids who were in the public school, and then at public school, black kids seemed to be frustrated by the presence of white kids like me, even though we were good whites, and then we all disliked the private school kids for whatever tainted reason they had.
All right. We know a little bit about that here in Boston. All right, so you wrote a piece in Harper Magazine in 1992 where you said that the integration in Mississippi, and especially in your town, has largely been a failure. And today we know that Leland High School, where you went, is about 7% white, and it started apparently at 20% white. I wanted to bring in Cheryl and Michael and ask you guys, we know today that Boston public schools are about 14% white. The public school body in Boston is about 14% white. Do you guys consider that integration was a failure?
Well, I wouldn't say failure, but I would say that there was a lot that could have been done differently. And for me, when I was in school, I remember there being so few black teachers. And even today, we still have like 46% are teachers of color in the Boston school. So the numbers do not correspond. So I don't think it's necessary for a school to be integrated in order to have good education. So I think because we have segregated neighborhoods, and we should not sugarcoat that, we do have segregated neighborhoods still to this day in Boston and surrounding communities, it is more difficult to have an integrated school in a segregated neighborhood.
I just want to point out a little irony, because in Mississippi, where there was an all-black school system, total segregation, they had black teachers, and that's what you were looking for.
That's right.
I mean, it's a very weird irony. Cheryl, just tell us really quickly, you graduated in 1973, right, which was a year before the landmark Garrity decision, which brought desegregation, court-ordered desegregation of Boston. Did you go to school with white kids?
Yeah, so I went to the Frank V. Thompson Middle School, and that was 67, 68, somewhere around there. And I've learned recently that the Boston Public Schools, the Boston School Committee, had put together a plan to reduce racial disparity in the city of Boston by having children from black communities get bused to white schools. So I went to an integrated middle school before the desegregation order went into effect.
All right, so Michael, yeah, do you think school integration in Boston was a failure?
I think that the goals of the desegregation order did not come to fruition. I always like to distinguish between desegregation and busing. The desegregation order was one thing, long overdue, and the righteous thing to do. The busing was the remedy to the fact that the schools were segregated in Boston. I also want to point out just one big difference actually between here and maybe in this community is In Boston and New Orleans in particular, those are two cities where you had equally poor black and white neighborhoods that were being told to desegregate and go to each other's schools, whereas some other parts of the country might have been about getting access to, white schools with more resources. In Boston, in South Boston High School, at the time of the desegregation order, South Boston High School had the most students on welfare citywide, more than any black or Latino neighborhood. So this was not really a good place to send poor and working class black kids when you're seeking equity. So in a way, it was kind of a big manipulation that happened for all. So it was, South Boston at the time held the highest concentration of white poverty in America. Roxbury was the poorest black neighborhood in Boston, and those were the two neighborhoods that we were gonna desegregate in phase one of busing in 1974, and do their high schools first. So sometimes I wonder if it wasn't set up for failure. So,
I'm just curious, by a show of hands, how many people in the audience would call the court-ordered desegregation a failure?
I think it was the right thing to do, but the remedy was
All right.
Sabotaged it in a way, is the way I feel.
I know, it's a weird question. It's one,
and I say the word
one.
Sabotage because I do think sometimes these things are intentional, because where we are today is that poor and working class black people and poor and working class white people and everyone else who's come here since, there's more Latinos and Asians now than there was at the time, but poor and working class people in general cannot afford to live in this city and have all had to move out. If you want to find my former neighbors, you'll find them either in the graveyard or the ones that were bused that first year, or you'll see them on the Methadone Mile. Or they're down in Quincy all the way to Barnstable in some hotel or something, you know what I mean? So so the class element kind of complicates things, never to take away from the very real racism that existed and still exists to this day, and is in line. It's intertwined with the class aspects.
All right,
you can't separate them really.
So another difference here is that Leland started it started out promising, right? You had a group of parents, white parents, who said, we're going to try to make this work. We believe schools can be saved. We're going to take an ad out in the paper that says we're going to send our kid to public school. Boston, the desegregation order was sort of seen as coming down from above. And I guess I just wanted to ask, maybe wrestle with that a little bit. I'd love for you to say, could anything have kept white kids in Leland?
Well, the one thing to remember that's very important, and in some respects I think these situations are maybe a little more parallel than they first seem, partly because things started off promising, in a sense, in a place like Leland, Mississippi, only because the expectation was that there would be no whites that would remain. The expectations were so low, and that's what happened in most communities like it, that it was extraordinary that in this one place, because of an odd sequence of variables, there was a little pocket of whites who remained. But from the very beginning, the best that they were likely to achieve was something like what has currently occurred in Boston. To have 20% white participation was the high watermark of the success there, and it was only in the very first year. And of course, in the very first year, you have events like what were described there. You didn't have things quite as violent and out of control as they sometimes were in Boston around in the busing protests and such. But you did have a lot. Yeah, there was a lot like that, and so it was promising in a sense, but it also was a failure from the start. One just little wrinkle that I'll mention that's I think interesting for people and that people forget is that in the sequence of these events, but between the Brown decision in '54 that says segregation is unconstitutional to the Garrity decision that triggers everything in Boston over that 19-year period, through most of that time, what's happening all over the South, and I think also in Boston, I think a place like Boston at the beginning of that sequence doesn't really see the Brown decision as having much application because Boston doesn't have a completely segregated system the way that the South did. But then what's happening over the 60s is that white Southerners are completely resisting this, as you well know, but toward the middle of the 60s and the end of the 60s, they began to do some of the things similar to what Cheryl is talking about. Not out of goodwill, but out of just realizing that we're going to be forced to finally abide by the Brown decision. And so the irony of this is that in the very late 60s, and in fact just a few months before this all happened in Mississippi, in what we talked about in the film, an agreement had been reached in Leland and a lot of other places around the South to begin a gradual and meaningful process toward integration. But essentially, it's the sort of thing that if it had begun in 1955, might have actually been a great success over the next 20 years. But it's not starting until this late point, and then the Supreme Court comes down in 1969, October 69, and says enough. Enough with all of this, including enough with things like what were happening in Boston by then. It's time for all vestiges of segregation to come to an end. And so there's this immediate declaration. That's why the schools close at Christmas and reopen 2 weeks later, completely integrated, as you were hearing described. And then it's not long before this catches up to a place like Boston.
So my mother's family is from Mississippi, and they came to her dad was a preacher, and they said, will you send your child to the white school? Because we gotta have an agreement. We have to be shown to be doing this. And my grandfather said, hell no. He was not interested. But so this is now bringing it to Boston. What is it about the court order that just set people off? Because as we see, you were bused to a white school. We know that your brother, you talk in your book about your brother. Well, before the Garrity order, your brother went to Charleston Tech with black kids. You talk about how they were friends before the busing order came down, and then the busing order came down, and suddenly there are riots. Your mother didn't say, son, you're not going to that school with black kids.
No, we hung out like this. This is my home. My grandparents met in this building. They were both from 2 different parts of Ireland, where the Irish dances happened. And I wouldn't be here if it weren't for this building. But and growing up, my mother played the accordion, not on this stage, but probably on a stage somewhere near where we're sitting. And so this was her life in her teens and early 20s. And I was doing a book reading once, someone told my mother, first time I saw my mother, she was step dancing on the sidewalk out front with a circle of people clapping around her. So this has kind of always been home. So when we were growing up, we always went shopping here. This was always, and Dudley was black at that point. And it was after busing, that stopped. And similarly, D Street Housing Project in South Boston, before busing, had 75 Latino Puerto Rican families in particular living in the D Street Housing Project. The week after the order, they were gone.
So is this about the pace of change and what happens or is it about who brings it? Is there, because you can also hear, you tell us, Cheryl, do you think that there's anything that would have caused Boston to change without these orders looming? Would community leaders have gotten together and changed or not?
So I want to go back almost 2 questions ago. There was never high hopes for busing in Boston when the desegregation order came down. Not in this city, because in this city, we already knew, blacks knew that if you go to South Boston to Carson Beach, you might not come back. That was just real, and nobody wanted to send their children to those neighborhoods. I can remember parents saying, how can I send my child to a neighborhood that I won't go to? And they were terrified, and I think that denigrated the number of parents who were involved in the school system because their children were in neighborhoods they would not go.
Did your parents want you to go to school with the white kids? Was that a priority for them?
It was not an issue of going to school with white kids. More the issue was going to a school with decent books and a decent building where education could happen and teachers had expectations that were reasonable and they believed that the children could rise up to them.
We still need that.
And we still need that. So
All
I
right.
don't think you need integration to get good schools, but you certainly need culturally competent teachers who are not lowering standards because of the hue of someone's skin. So as it relates to whether or not integration can work or whether we should have whites and blacks going to school together, it's an important question, no question about it. But I don't think it's the right question. I think the right question is, why can't we have equal schools in every community?
All right, I'm going to ask Michael one more real question, like a deep question, and then I want to hear we want to get some of your questions. I think there's some, what's that?
It's all deep.
Well, so I got really into reading your book in the last few days, and the picture of your neighborhood and you growing up. You didn't go to South Boston High, but you grew up in Southie.
Right, I was 8 during the riots, so.
Yes. So, but South Boston High was the only high school in Boston that had 0 non-whites. Every other high school, even Charlestown, had a dozen.
Right.
What would it have taken to get non-whites? Is there any way that non-whites would have been allowed into South Boston High without the order and all the police and all the mayhem?
I think an important, an important piece in all of this also to keep in mind is that the school committee at the time, as well as the leadership in South Boston, you had the likes of Jimmy Kelly, and you had Louise Day Hicks, and the school committee, and you had people like Dapper O'Neill. I mean, this was a truly villainous crowd. I don't want to use the evil word, but it was a really villainous crowd that was holding the entire city back in so many ways. And the leadership in South Boston in particular was the leadership of racist demagogues. And in trying to, what they needed, as most racist demagogues, this is kind of happening on a national level, they need an enemy, and they need to make people afraid and make people jump into their arms. And we had about 5 or 6 Trumps in my neighborhood, you know what I mean? So we have to keep that in mind too. And their kids did not go to the public schools. Their kids were in private schools, or they were at Boston Latin maybe, or Catholic schools. The other thing I just wanted to mention too is that years later, as an adult, after I wrote All Souls, I was on a panel with Ruth Batson, who was one of the major leaders of the time, an incredible civil rights icon in Boston, who did a lot of incredible work. And we were on a panel about busing in 1999. Judge Garrity was supposed to be there. He actually passed away that week before, so that was unfortunate. But Ruth and I became friends, and we would talk about this stuff a lot, and one of the things that really sticks out in my mind is her refrain that when we got to South Boston High School and I looked around, I said, this is not what we meant. So sending to an equally crappy school. I need to be careful because it's being filmed, not to swear, so.
All right.
Farah, can I just add one thing to that? Yeah,
sure.
Because the description Michael gives of the leadership at the time sounds a lot like Mississippi in 1966, these villainous figures. But I also think, though, that all of this, and having now gone back and sort of meticulously tried to understand what happened in this one place and a bunch of others too, is that one thing that comes through over and over again from blacks and whites in the conversations that I have is nobody really understood what was about to happen. That really just white or black. There was just an inability to imagine what this next thing was going to be. 2, what was being attempted all across the country, whether it's the southern version or the northeastern version, what's being attempted is something that's never been attempted before. And there was no particular playbook for it. And then when you add on top of that there really is no leadership, the leadership at the time all around the country is generally the worst kind of leadership. So there's no plan, there's no leadership, there are no real resources. Small amount of money that had been set aside at one point to try to provide for leadership through federal funding was cut out by the Nixon administration after the 1968 election. And so you really have America undertaking the most extraordinary social experiment in a century, maybe in its entire history, with no real guidance, no real plan, except an understanding that history demanded change, demanded that things had to be different. And that we know was the right thing. Things had to be changed. But it's not a surprise that things went as badly as they did.
But I do want to point out that today, South Boston High is integrated. It's a school that exists, it's integrated, and it wasn't before. So we can talk about failure all we want, but there are places that that you can point to as successes. So it really depends on your definition. I want to hear from you guys. I could talk and ask questions all night. Come on up and anybody up to the microphone, all you people who've been on your reading circles, we want to hear from you.
Cheryl and Michael. Is this on? Yes, I guess it is. What does your personal experience and your stories and your closeness to Boston tell you should be going on today?
Yeah, thank you for that question about the future. Back during the desegregation order, communities were not involved in the decision. Community leaders were not asked for input. There wasn't a compilation of stakeholders put together to say what's going to be the best way to educate students. I think going forward, there has to be a cross-section of stakeholders brought together, particularly parents, students, community leaders, as well as school officials, to identify what is the best way to deliver education to the students in the community. And if we talk to one another, that will move us much further than if we have edicts from on high or decisions without choice, which was what was so powerful about Leland, is that they had free choice. So people made decisions about who went to the school and who didn't. So I think that's important. I also think it's important to talk about what cultural proficiency really means and how do we impose expectations or have teachers who are educated enough to know how to operate with students from various backgrounds and can see cultural differences not as cultural deficiencies. So I think that would be some of the important things to do.
I think I feel like a lot of the work, a lot of your calling has been shaped by those years and those experiences, and I always feel like that too. It's probably the most important experience, those years for me, in then later becoming an activist and a community organizer, working on anti-violence initiatives, but especially on bringing people together across racial differences on those initiatives. And so I always feel like it's at the grassroots where I see the most impact, where people can have conversations where you're starting with people's pain, actually, where people are coming from in terms of the pain in their lives and the difficulties in their lives and the trauma in their lives. Throughout the 90s, I was working mostly among survivors of homicide victims throughout the city, from Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, from Charlestown, who are white working class, and then from Southie. And, you know, it was incredible to see the solidarity that would happen, unfortunately, in that very unfortunate club, you know. And I also want to point out an incredible leader tonight. We have Janet Connors in the audience, who also is a survivor and who has spent her whole life doing anti-racist work. Grew up in a Southie part of Dorchester, like a neighborhood very much like the neighborhood I grew up in. And from those very early days was doing anti-racist work during that period. But also works in that place, that grassroots place, connecting with people. And they're like this incredible sisterhood that we have in the city of Boston, an incredible resource that we don't turn to enough. Those survivors, especially survivors of homicide victims and survivors of losses to the drug trade, people who have that pain in common and who are doing incredible community building across racial backgrounds. And I think that they really, I see them as our potential leadership in moving forward. For me, it's also hard to talk about Boston proper only these days, because for the most part, the population I grew up around, the white people I grew up with, they're gone. So Southie and Charlestown were gentrified out, they're gone. And they're, you know, like I said, if they're not in the grave or on the Methadone Mile, they're somewhere on the South Shore in parts of Quincy and Braintree all the way down to Barnstable County, in more affordable parts of the state. And the same is happening now to the black community, which is being pushed out to the more, the outer suburbs. So we kind of have to think a little bit in talking about the healing going forward and the work we have to do in the community building. We have to really think beyond Boston, I think, if we're going to talk about bringing together, which is my thing, bringing together working class and poor people across racial backgrounds.
Which is quite rare.
Happens over the 90s. It really happened in this city. Incredible movement.
Mr. Blackmon, thank you. I really appreciated the snippet that we got to see. I really appreciated the snippet that we got to see. And of course, the class divisions that you were describing as you talked really started with Brown versus Board and continued, of course. And so we see that playbook kind of being picked up in a lot of different places. I was wondering how so many white folks in Leland could afford to go to private schools. They were in public schools because, most of us were working class. So, those class divisions just kind of disappeared and everybody got in?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, a great sort of practical, logical, mechanical question. But it also speaks to, again, there's a Boston parallel in a sense, and that is that in 1969, if we could reach into the minds of all the members of the U.S. Supreme Court in January of 1969 and had asked them, is it possible that there could be, that if we issued an order that forced a big and unpopular change in public schools in Boston, is it possible that huge numbers of people could actually somehow avoid the consequences of that ruling? And they would have said no, they really can't. Just like Veronica Richardson said in the clip when she's talking about, I didn't understand why did all these white people leave, but she says in there that if you caught it, she said, well, at first they had to come to the public schools because there wasn't anywhere else to go, and so there was a sort of failure of imagination at the time, because it seemed it would have been inconceivable, the idea that thousands of towns across the American South could literally overnight, create a whole new private school system.
Were those segregation academies cheap enough for the working class whites? That's the question, right?
And so part of the reason that was unimaginable would be that you would say, well, there's no way all these people, sure, there are a lot of wealthy planters in Mississippi, they could send their kids to private schools, but not all these run-of-the-mill regular white folks like my family, or even poorer white families. The reason they could do it, though, was because and they were cheap enough for all white families to go. But the reason for that, though, was because the white elite became patrons, and essentially subsidized them. And so, even to the point, though, that for years and years and years, if a new white family moved into a community like this, they would be almost literally met at the city limits and told right off the bat. I grew up with kids whose families were from Ohio or Michigan or wherever, and so this is all alien to them. But they would be told as soon as they moved into the town, either at church or by some other means, they would get the word that don't send your kids to the public schools. They're terrible and dangerous, and if you can't afford it, don't worry about it. Go to the private school. It'll be worked out.
Let's have one more question here.
Hello, my name is Leola Hampton. Thank you all. Tonight is really healing for me because I was one of those kids on the bus in 1974 going to South Boston, and I'm 57 years old now and have been struggling with the trauma that I had to deal with. Michael, I've had your book for so many years, and once I get to the section on busing, everything starts coming back, and I have to put it down and try to pick it back up later. I have also written about my experience, and what I hear a lot when white people read it is like, wow, I've never heard, the part from the black kids and what they endured. And, those rocks that you talk about and sticks, we were on the other end of those, and it took a long time to heal. And yes, it was a failure because the city never thought about what we went through. How were we to deal with what was going on there? We were only 14 years old. We had no resolve. We had no idea of how to process that sort of violence. But thank God that time heals all wounds, and we've been in these reading circles and they've been great. So thank you guys for this.
Did you finish at Southie High?
No, I went to 3 high schools and eventually ended up at Tennessee State University. I had to go to HBCU. I just had to get out of Boston. It just was necessary for my healing, but.
And thank you for that. And also make sure I get your information, because I do a lot of writing groups around the city and would love
I
to
saw that on your
work with you. Yeah,
Facebook, so I will be in touch.
Yeah, because we need that book.
Okay, thank you.
And also, if you look at the routes that were taken, you have to wonder. I mean, all the violence really happened on the outskirts of the projects, and the projects could have been avoided, and they weren't. And that you always, I just think it's strange that they maintain that route when it could have gone by the beach and a whole different route and so forth.
Thank you so much for sharing with us.
I have to say that whenever I talk to audiences about busing, we hear stories like yours, and the trauma that people still carry with them, and the paralyzing fear that they still have. Some people have said that they didn't even complete their education. They dropped out of high school. What is seared in my mind as a young girl growing up during this busing time was when the buses rolled into South Boston and all of the adults were lined on the streets raging and throwing rocks at children in the buses. And those buses had to sit there with those kids in it. They couldn't let them go off because it was unsafe. I think that it's so important for us to reflect on that past and that history, and then try to figure out what can we learn from that, so that we're not repeating it and we're not abandoning our school system. Because too often, many blacks will say, I'm not going to become involved because the school system won't listen to me, or the school system is marginalizing my voice or not hearing my voice. So I want to use this forum tonight to raise up agency and say that you have power, you have the ability to make the schools what they need to be, and I hope that people will use their power.
I want to read one question from a card. In the book Common Ground, there was discussion about an earlier busing program, but because of a lack of cooperation, the court went for the most punitive plan. Could it have been different?
Is that you mean Operation Exodus? Or?
So I'm not sure. There's several things it could be talking about. Yeah. It could be talking about the school committee plan, which did. Well, you were bused. Yes. You were bused. So there was some busing happening before the Garrity decision. So it could be saying that didn't go far enough. That Garrity's decision said that didn't go far enough, but it was in existence. It could be talking about Operation Exodus. So black activists in Roxbury organized private funding to take kids from Roxbury to a school in Beacon Hill, and they did that for years. And I'm not sure if that was what this person is referring to, but the question really is, could things have been different? And I think that's an important question to reflect on, because what we're really asking is, what should we do now that's different? How can we learn from the past, take the painful things that happened in the past, and do something differently now? What do we feel called to do now, knowing what we know about history? So I would love to take these two questions. Maybe we could take you guys. You could ask yours, you could ask yours, and then we can respond as a panel, because we want to hear from as many people as possible. Sure. Does that work? Mm-hmm. You and then whoever on this side, and then we can have the panel respond.
Hi, my name's Megan Doran. I had a hard time answering that question, was school desegregation a failure? Because I do think it was a failure, and I'm glad that when I started the Boston Public Schools in 1986, I did not start in a segregated system. So I think it was a failure, but it also made some really major changes in the long run that needed to happen. But I also have stayed in Boston and had the privilege of working with the Boston Busing Desegregation Project, which was a project to the Union of Minority Neighborhoods. And our report is in the booklet for tonight's event. And one of the things that we really grappled with a lot in that project is the question that you raised, Reverend Harris: why can't we have equal quality schools in every neighborhood? So I wanted to put that back to you. What can we learn from school desegregation and what has happened since? Why can't we have that? Why can't we have nice things? And you asked the question, but how do you answer it? What do you make of it?
I'm a Bostonian, born and raised here, and the racism that still exists in this city, but things are different. They're a little better than they were back in the 60s and 70s. In the 60s and 70s, I'm not sure what we could have done because the racism was so heated and violent and aggressive, and as Michael said, it was coming from the authority figures of the Boston School Committee, Louise Day Hicks and others. So I think it would have been really impossible to do anything about it then. Today, I think what can happen is that we have to have mixed race, mixed gender groups coming together, adults who want to help their children get educated, and educators who want to educate students come together and break through with different ways of educating students. And we need to make sure that these buildings in which our children are educated are safe and that there's water in the buildings, that children can drink from a bubbler. I mean, there's a lot that can be done. It's almost like you need to go through the schools with a punch list and let us all feel where the disparities are so that we can come together and work together.
Cheryl, you talk about mixed race, but you didn't mention mixed income.
So this whole class thing, sometimes I think class can be a cop-out because I really think the problem is race, and that's where I focus my work. And many other scholars and folks who are doing this work on diversity, equity, inclusion like I am, and anti-race agree that the big barracuda for us in our society is how we treat black people. And I think if we start there, then we will be able to address other persons of color. It's not to say other persons of color are not also discriminated against, but the issue oftentimes is the color of the skin, not the income. While those two poor communities were pitted against one another, we still have major issues in schools where the predominant population are black students, and I think we have to start there and then work. And I think we're smart enough. There's enough people who know what to do to come up with some creative ways. I understand that the Office of Equity at the Boston Public Schools is doing some work, and this year we've hired more.
We're going to get your question, and I think Fran's going to come and take my microphone.
So thank you for that, because I'm a public high school teacher in Massachusetts, and this is Massachusetts, not Arizona, and it's still a struggle here. I teach at Chelsea High School, a school that's overwhelmingly Latino and immigrant. Obviously, I'm a white woman who used to work at Lexington and graduated from Newton South. Hi, I love you. So I guess my question is, I'm glad that you have made so many important points about the problems, the conflict between race and economic poverty while not absolving white people of racism. What is the role of schools that are so underfunded and demonized, especially white teachers in schools primarily of color and poverty, to help move us to a better place with regards to race issues, especially white teachers?
So much. We put on schools. So much we put on schools, right?
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about demonize? Help me understand
I'm thinking right now of the Betsy DeVos sort of administration that is saying that public schools should be starved out in favor of privatization and you know, supporting religious schools with the same money that's supposed to go to public schools, and public schools are being punished for failing. My students are about 30% or more have been in the country for less than 2 or 3 years, then they're taking a test in English. So of course my school is going to have lower marks. What can white teachers do to help move us forward in anti-racism?
I'm ask people to keep it real short just because I know that we're
I'm happy to keep it short. What your question generates for me is this binary choice we seem to make all the time of us and them. And that we need to eradicate that and determine what do we have in common. And if we all love our children, which most people love their children, and they want their children to be well educated, and if we want to leave this society to some great leaders, then we have to invest not just in the students, but in the teachers too. And I think if we can find the place where we all agree, right? That sounds like a good Baptist preacher conversation, right? Right? We have to find the place where we all agree. And with our children, we agree. And we agree that good education is good for everybody. And we, as far as I remember, we the people have the power to make the change. And we can demand our politicians to get behind us as opposed to us trying to follow them or react to them. So I think we have a lot that we can do proactively if we would, in grassroots, as Michael is saying, that if we would come together, we could really address this. I happen to be a very optimistic person, thank God for faith, and I believe that we can do anything. And as we said, we've seen integration change, and we can do more. One last thing I want to say, I live in the city of Attleboro, and we have organization called the Greater Attleboro Interfaith Network. That network is comprised of different clergy. We meet every month with the police chief and the mayor to make sure that we don't have any kind of situation like happened in Ferguson, Missouri, or other parts. And then we bring the community together. So it's possible to do great things.
I really quickly wanted to say in relation to your question, and also in relation to the woman who commented on the kind of face-to-face interactions and the differences that those can make. It's really, I just want to emphasize that we have to be doing more of this, not online, not on social media, but face-to-face, because it is what makes the difference. And neuroscientists will tell you that without a face, there's no empathy. And that's why you have the kind of, binary, bomb-throwing enmity you see on Twitter. It's not face-to-face. We have to do more of this and get back out into the streets and into the neighborhoods and into rooms like this and have face-to-face interactions.
And I'll say real quickly 3 things. The first one is we can't fool ourselves. It's all very true that this gathering of people tonight and the complexions, the range of complexions here is a wonderful thing to see, and probably couldn't have happened 50 years ago. Certainly couldn't have happened in Mississippi. But we can't fool ourselves by some of the positive numbers we see. The reality is that integration does work in places where the black population is no more than 20% of the whole population. White people don't have a problem with a few black people in their lives. They have a problem when it's a lot. And so it is about race. So it's still an issue, and there are a lot of people in America, the black kids in my town and back in Mississippi, know fewer white people and know less about white people than their counterparts did when I was a kid. All of life is more separate, and that does lead to more separation, more despair, more hostility. Second thing is we have to put the importance of public schools back at the center of our national discussions, and we have to fight against the people who call them government schools and say that they're fundamentally bad. But we have to think of public schools the way that we think about the importance of the military or whatever you want it to be, but this fundamental part of what has made America what it is today. And the last thing is we don't pay enough in taxes. I know nobody wants to hear that, but we do not pay enough in taxes. And anybody who tells you that it's good money after bad to spend more on public education is crazy. It's just crazy. And so if you appeal your property taxes every year, and I know property taxes are terrible around here, but if you appeal it every year and are proud when you get it lowered, you're working against your own interests.
Okay, so quickly, before people split, this section is what now? So I'd like you to reflect on what you've heard in your own experiences. See, because public education, first I want you to imagine what it would take and what it would look like if we had excellent public education for all public school students across the country. I just want you to think about that for a minute. Then I want you to gather around with some strangers, and I want you to think about what you can do to move that vision forward. See, because I'm an activist who's been trying to help the Boston Public Schools do the right thing for 40 years, and I need a lot of help to move that district. And I believe that all of us have influence. So I want you to reflect and visualize what it would look like, and then what can you do, given where you are right now in the social landscape, to dismantle white supremacy and to create racially just places of learning for all children. And I'd also want to add that the white folks and white teachers need to decolonize our hearts, because we weren't white and people of African descent weren't black. Race is a social construct. Institutional racism operates within institutions and within our hearts and minds. So please talk to your neighbors and come up with strategies, and then I'm going to ask you to shout them out, and then I'm going to reach out to you and ask you to hold yourselves accountable for taking action now. Thank you very much.